Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really zooming in, taking a magnifying glass to just one line of text, a really powerful one, often debated.
Yeah, this is all about that friction, when an ancient sacred story kind of bumps up against what we now know from science.
We are looking specifically at Surah Al-Kahf, that's chapter 18 of the Quran, the cave.
And it features this, legendary figure, Dhul-Qarnayn, often called the Two-Horned One, a righteous ruler who goes on this epic journey.
Right, and the specific line, the one that sparks all the debate, is verse 18.86. It describes his journey way out west. The text says, "Until when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a spring of dark mud," or some translate it Spring, Ain Hamia.
Yeah.
And he found near to people.
And that's the crux. Our mission today, for you listening, is really to unpack the conflict this single verse stirs up. It touches on theology, history, language, and obviously modern science.
It's perception versus reality in these ancient texts, isn't it?
Exactly. Because on one side, you have this incredibly vivid, poetic description from a text revered by, billions. On the other side, established scientific fact.
The sun's 93 million miles away.
Right. And its setting is just an illusion caused by Earth spinning. It can't physically dip into a pond, muddy or not. So how do people square that circle? That's what we're digging into.
Okay, let's tackle that critical view head on then. When critics look at 18.86, what's the fundamental problem they see? What are they really focusing on?
Well, the core of the critique, it really comes down to the idea of divine omniscience. The argument is, look, if a text claims to be from an all-knowing creator, why describe the sunset using what seems like, outdated cosmology?
You mean the old idea that the sun actually traveled around the Earth and physically went somewhere at night?
Precisely, geocentric cosmology. So, for critics, describing the sun setting in a muddy spring looks like proof that the text reflects the science of the 7th century, not some timeless universal truth. It seems like a scientific error.
And a lot of this seems to hinge on one specific Arabic word, washada. Tell us about that.
Yeah, washada. It means he found. Critics really zero in on this.
Why is he found so crucial?
Because, they argue, it implies an objective discovery. Like, Dhul-Qarnayn went there and factually found the sun doing this. It wasn't just his impression.
So it pushes it beyond poetry, making it sound like a statement of fact by the text itself.
That's the argument. If the text asserts this as objective reality, and that reality contradicts science, then from their perspective, the text is simply wrong on a factual level.
And this isn't just a modern thing, right? Critics point out that some early Islamic commentators seem to take it quite literally too.
That's a key point in the critical argument, yeah. They'll point to highly respected early scholars like Al-Tabari back in the 9th century. His commentary suggests he understood Dhul-Qarnayn traveled to the literal edge of the inhabited world and saw this happen.
Which would make sense for his time.
Absolutely. Back then, everyone, pretty much everywhere, worked with a geocentric model. They didn't know the sun was millions of miles away. It seemed logical it had to go somewhere when it set. So critics argue the modern idea that it's just perception is, a later reinterpretation, an apologetic move to make the text fit with modern astronomy.
Okay, that lays out the critical perspective pretty strongly.
Yeah.
So how do modern and classical Islamic scholars respond? What's their main defense against this charge?
The primary defense, the one you hear most often, relies on the idea of phenomenological language.
Phenomenological, meaning how things appear to us.
Exactly. They argue the verse isn't trying to make a scientific statement about astronomy. It's describing Dhul-Qarnayn's subjective perception, what he saw from where he was standing, way out west.
Like a visual description.
Precisely. Think about it. If you stand on a vast coastline, say the Atlantic shore, and watch the sun go down, what do you see?
You see it touch the water, sink into it.
Right. And if the water near the shore is maybe shallow or has sediment or it's just getting dark, it could easily look like a dark, murky, or even muddy pool as the light fades. The verse, they say, is capturing that powerful visual experience.
I like the analogy they often use. It's something we all do every day, even knowing the science.
It's the sunrise and sunset defense. We all know the Earth rotates, right? But we still say, wow, what a beautiful sunset, or I woke up before sunrise.
Yeah, we don't say Earth's rotation revealed the sun.
Exactly. We use the language of our direct experience, phenomenological language, because it communicates the experience effectively. So scholars argue the Quran using similar perceptual language in a 7th century story isn't an error. It's just how humans communicate about what they see.
Okay, but that critic might push back on the specific detail. A spring of dark mud. Ain Hamia. That sounds very physical, very specific. Harder to just pass off as a generic sunset.
That's a fair point, and this brings us back to the linguistics, back to Wahada. Scholars argue that in this specific context, Wahada doesn't have to mean he factually discovered. It can also mean he perceived it as, or he found it to be, or it appeared to him as setting.
So it's describing his impression of the scene.
Yes. The muddy spring, Ain Hamia, is part of the description of the place he reached the end of the land, perhaps a marshy coastal area where he witnessed the perceptual event of the sunset. It describes the location where he saw the sun seemingly set, not that the sun itself went into mud.
That interpretation makes sense. And doesn't the defense get stronger when they look at the rest of the story? Internal consistency?
It does, and this is a very strong point for the scholars. Dhul-Qarnayn doesn't stop there. He travels east. Verse 1890 says he reached the rising place of the sun. And the text says he found, using that exact same verb, wahada, he found the sun rising on a people.
Right, which, if you take that literally, is just as strange.
Yeah.
The sun doesn't physically rise on a specific group of people.
Precisely. No one argues the sun literally emerges from behind a particular tribe. It must mean he traveled to the furthest known point east, and there he found or encountered people living in that region, perhaps without much shelter.
So the argument is, if Wahada clearly means found, in a narrative or perceptual sense, in the East verse,
then why insist on a rigidly literal scientific reading for the West verse, 18.86? The narrative logic itself suggests we should read both passages phenomenologically, describing his journeys and encounters at the perceived limits of the world.
Okay, so putting aside the linguistic fine points for a moment, the ultimate argument from the scholarly side is about the purpose of the story.
Absolutely. They stress that the Quran isn't primarily a science textbook, it's a guide for morality and theology. The story of Dhul-Qarnayn is meant as a parable.
About what?
About justice, good leadership, humility before God, dealing with challenges, the vastness of God's creation. It's showing a righteous ruler acting justly at the farthest reaches of the known world. The cosmology, the setting sun, is just the backdrop of familiar language for the 7th century audience for this moral drama. To critique its physics is to miss the point entirely.
Okay, let's shift focus outward a bit. Historically, was this idea, sun setting in water, unique to the Quran or Arabia?
Oh, far from it. This was actually a very, very common idea in ancient cosmology, almost universal before science changed things.
How so?
In many ancient cultures, the Earth was generally seen as flat, or at least flatter than we know it, surrounded by water. So logically, the sun had to go somewhere when it disappeared. Setting into the Western Ocean or descending into an underworld beneath the waves was a common explanation. It wasn't some strange Arabian idea.
Can you give examples?
Sure. Think of ancient Egypt, the sun god Ra, journeying through the underworld each night after setting in the west. Or Mesopotamian myths, which often had the sun god passing through cosmic waters. The whole idea of a hero traveling to the ends of the earth was a standard trope in late antiquity. That western horizon was the perceived edge.
And this backdrop of shared ancient ideas leads us to something critics find very compelling: the Alexander Romance.
Yes, the Alexander Romance. This is crucial context. It was basically a collection of legendary stories about Alexander the Great, hugely popular across the Middle East and the Mediterranean world for centuries before Islam.
And the connection. Why is it so important here?
Because critics point to really striking parallels between these pre-Islamic legends and the Dhul-Qarnayn story in the Quran, very specific parallels.
Such as?
Well, certain versions, especially the Syriac ones, describe Alexander traveling to the absolute ends of the earth. And specifically, he sees the sun setting in a fetid sea or a poisonous sea. Sound familiar?
Very. Setting in a strange body of water at the western edge.
Exactly. And crucially, those same legends often describe Alexander building a great wall or gate to keep out the savage tribes of Gog and Magog.
Which is also a major event in the Dhul-Qarnayn story in Surah Al-Kahf. He builds the barrier against Yajuj and Majuj, Gog and Magog.
Right, so you have the journey to the setting sun and the building of the gate against Gog and Magog in both the older Alexander legends and the Quranic narrative. This structural similarity is undeniable and leads to two very different interpretations.
Okay, what's the first interpretation? The critical one.
The critical view sees this as evidence of derivation. They argue the Quranic story likely borrowed or adapted these narrative elements directly from the widely known Alexander legends. In doing so, it naturally incorporated the pre-scientific cosmology, the sun setting in the sea that was part of that older story package. For them, it shows the story's human origins, shaped by existing myths.
Makes sense. And the second view, the traditional Islamic scholarly one.
They see it as correction or maybe repurposing. The argument here is that the Quran isn't just copying. It's deliberately taking a figure and story, Alexander, often seen as a pagan figure in these legends that his audience already knew very well, and it's recasting the hero.
How so?
By making him Dhul Qarnayn, a righteous monotheistic servant of God. The Quran, in this view, is engaging with the popular legend, purifying it, and using its familiar structure and geography to teach a new monotheistic ethical message. The shared elements don't prove borrowing an error. They show the Quran connecting with its audience's cultural knowledge to deliver its own message.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the question from, did the text make a scientific mistake, to something more like, what was the text doing with the common knowledge and stories of its time?
Precisely. It puts the focus back on the intended meaning and moral purpose, rather than getting bogged down in the literal accuracy of the, let's say, stage setting.
Okay, so we've looked at the science clash, the linguistic arguments over Wahada, the story's internal consistency, and this whole fascinating historical backdrop with the Alexander romance. If we try to synthesize this, find some common ground, what can both sides reasonably agree on?
Well, I think there are two key points of agreement, regardless of belief. First, everyone has to acknowledge that the literal description in the verse, sun setting in a pool, aligns perfectly with the common pre-scientific understanding of the world in the 7th century. That's just historical context.
Undeniable. And the second point?
Second, that the core message or the ethical thrust of the Dhul Qarnayn story about justice, power, responsibility, dealing with different peoples, acknowledging God, these themes are powerful and relevant, quite apart from the cosmological details. The moral of the story transcends the setting.
Okay, so let's crystallize the final takeaways for each perspective. For the believer.
For the believer, the conclusion is generally that the verse uses familiar, perceptual language, the language people actually use to describe what they see, to teach enduring moral and theological truths. The apparent contradiction only appears if you mistakenly impose a modern, literal, scientific reading onto a 7th century text with different goals. It's seen as narratively and experientially true, not necessarily astrophysically literal.
And for the critical perspective, the final word.
The critical perspective concludes that the verse is fundamentally a product of its time. It reflects the mythological landscape, particularly the Alexander legends, and the cosmological understanding of 7th century Arabia. The scientific inaccuracy is seen not as a mistake to be explained away, but as positive evidence pointing towards the text's human origins and its grounding in a specific historical moment.
This has been incredibly illuminating. It really shows how vital understanding history, language, and culture is when we approach any ancient text, especially one held sacred. You can't just read it like a modern science report.
Absolutely. The context is everything. And maybe it leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on.
Go for it.
We still, every single day, talk about the sun rising and setting, even though we know scientifically that's not what's happening. We know it's the earth turning. Does this persistent use of phenomenological language describing reality as we see it, not just as we intellectually know it, tell us something important? Does it suggest that human communication, storytelling, perhaps even our basic understanding of reality sometimes needs the language of direct experience, even when it clashes with scientific fact? What does that imply about how we make sense of the world?